Why, hello there, and welcome to another ramble. I'm Corny Swiss,
Corny Phil.
and today we're going to be discussing War Thunder Naval Forces. Now, to completely, I guess, pre-fire this subject, we know nothing about when naval forces will make their way into War Thunder. I don't expect it to be any time within the next calendar year. I don't think we'll see a alpha or even a beta until sometime after this a calendar year from today, basically.
In other words, this entire ramble is going to be pure speculation and firing from the hip.
Basically, we got our 6 shooters ready and we're pulling the trigger. But basically, what we're going to discuss is World of Warships is out, and we've both been playing it, and I think this is kind of like a thought discussion about what would naval forces look like in War Thunder, right? Because there's a clear difference between World of Tanks and War Thunder ground forces. You know, the whole idea about health bars and things like that, and that's made its way into World of Warships. You know, your ships have health bars and things like that, but they've kind of added new ways of making ships more delicate and making some ships really powerful. If that makes any sense, like the whole detonation thing. Um, where basically your ship just blows up because something critical, catastrophic happens.
Yeah, dropping a bomb inside of another bomb tends to make an even bigger bomb.
Yeah,
That's just how this works.
yeah. So basically, we want to kind of brainstorm what World of Warships would look like if you put it in War Thunder. So I guess the first thing I'll kind of just lay out is, I mean, the thing about War Thunder is it does not use health bars. That's the fundamental difference. That's really actually kind of the only difference between wargaming products and Gaijin products. Is that they, or at least in terms of War Thunder and World of Tanks, World of Warships, that Gaijin just doesn't use HP bars, which gives you opportunities to like one-shot players and things like that and do all kinds of crazy stuff like that. There's also a better sort of modular damage system in War Thunder where like you can kill individual crew members or knock them out or whatever you want to call it. Whereas in World of Tanks, your modules have like HP bars, and if they get hit and they take some damage, then it breaks that module and then it starts repairing, whatever. Well, World of Warships is kind of the same way in the sense that if your steering gets knocked out, well, after like a minute and a half, it'll be repaired. If you get set on fire, after about a little less than a minute, the fire will go out. If you start flooding a little over a minute, that'll, plug itself. In War Thunder, none of that happens. If you're on fire, you stay on fire. I imagine if you're taking on water, you will continue to take on water until it's dealt with. So I guess the key difference that World of Warships and a War Thunder Naval Forces would have is that it's the opportunity to one-shot someone where you have a shell penetrate the citadel or penetrate a magazine and blow it up is pretty common, right? In theory, it should be a fairly reasonable chance. And I don't know. It's interesting because for tanks it makes sense to have no HP bar and kind of the more modular damage. For a ship, like if your ship just all of a sudden has holes in it, that seems to be like a fundamental problem, right? Like if
Yeah,
you're
except that a lot of these ships are built to take that kind of punishment. So, I mean, there would be. I feel like ships are less fragile than tanks on a fundamental scale. Like, if you're driving around a New York class battleship as an example, like it has belts of armor on its side. You can put shells into its hull, but most of them are probably going to get caught in the armor and not cause serious damage. So, like, I agree that there's this notion of you're going to be having more risk of one shots. I still don't know if I don't know if it's going to be as bad as you're describing it.
well, honestly, I think it might be worse. And the reason I think that, I'll use ground force as kind of an example. So in ground forces, when all basically the trajectory of shells is generally straight on, right? The trajectory is usually pretty flat. In World of Warships has shown us this. In naval actions, the shells are going to be plunging down. So at long range, armor is going to be irrelevant. It's your deck armor. And deck armor is never thick enough, really, to protect against incoming shells. So I actually think that plunging fire would result in a lot more one-hit kills or highly, highly critical or catastrophic hits. Simply because
Okay, that makes sense.
it's a way to get around armor that you don't have in ground forces, right? If you're faced against a tank with an angled KV-1, you can't just sort of lob your shell up and have it come down on the engine deck. It just doesn't work, you know. So
And I think something I want to address before we get too further down another tangent is like the fundamental difference you said, is the health bar versus kind of module through War Thunder. Really, in some ways you can almost quantify that as, like you've said in previous rambles and other videos that, Wargaming, World of Tanks and World of Warships has taken a very arcade approach. Gaijin and War Thunder has taken a very realistic approach. The issue that you have coming into naval forces is that the real life of naval warfare is not really that conducive to a game, and I think that that's the area we're going to have to spend a lot of time thinking about, and I imagine the game designers are having to spend, because you're looking at, I believe that the percentage is something like less than 5%. We're talking 1 to 2% accuracy for battleship guns in direct combat, because they're not firing from 10 kilometers, they're firing from 30. They're firing over the horizon.
In some cases,
kind of distances. Yeah, and then in World of Warships, one thing that people have pointed out, complaining about whether carriers are OP or underpowered, is, one person made a very good point saying, carriers really got a huge nerf being put in this game, because no carrier in their right mind would be this close to the battle. They should be 200 kilometers away in sending their planes in.
I guess in theory, how many carriers were actually sunk due to enemy fire, like direct fire from like a battleship or a cruiser?
I can only think of one, and that was a submarine ambushing a damaged
carrier. Submarine doesn't count, I don't think.
Yeah,
I'm talking like cruiser or battleship direct fire onto a carrier. I don't think if it's happened, it happens extraordinarily rare.
I can't think of it.
That is actually a very good point.
Yeah, granted, in World War II, there simply wasn't a lot of that kind of conflict. I mean, there were plenty of battles like that.
But a lot of them.
But a lot of the big set pieces where you had the huge fleets banging away at each other, a lot of that was done with the carrier planes. You talk about like the Battle of Midway, which is holds this big historical mark as the first major naval action where the two opposing sides never actually saw each other.
Yeah.
And that's one of the set piece battles. If you go to if you want to realistically model naval warfare, it's basically anti-aircraft simulator and pilot simulator.
Yeah, I guess if you put it in that perspective, yeah. I guess in the Atlantic it was less about carriers. I'm not sure many carriers operate in the Atlantic.
Yeah. So there were submarine hunter
carriers. Yeah, and then earlier in the war, it was more set-piece battleship. I imagine was more set-piece naval force, but then again, the American fleet was not doing so well in the early parts of the Japanese theater of war. So, yeah, but I guess we should draw it back because we know carriers. I'm not sure they're going to be in naval forces. I mean, I don't know anything, obviously, but Actually, yeah, I mean, basically. But carriers, I could see them making their way into naval forces just because we already have an air arm. We already have air power in the game, Like, I thought putting carriers in World of Warships was more of a stretch than putting carriers into naval forces. Now, obviously, I'll say it again, we don't know anything about naval forces. We just know that from what I've read, ground forces and naval forces were developed in parallel. And then ground forces was determined to be more successful or more easier to finish or whatever. So they just put their resources on the ground forces and pushed it. But
Yeah, but I
naval
mean, I can
forces withdrawn to
imagine.
the back burner.
Yeah, I can imagine carriers being World of Warships, or not World of Warships.
Naval force,
War
because we
Thunder
already
ground or
have
naval forces.
like a bunch of planes and stuff you can take off. I think every nation has
Yeah,
a fleet, a
yeah.
carrier-borne aircraft arm.
But I guess what I'm saying is that that would be true, except it would almost always be an NPC carrier.
I
Like,
don't think
there's not
that's
going to be. Well,
well,
I
maybe,
mean,
but at the same time, that doesn't have to be a thing. I mean, you look at World of Warships. There's an average. There's not always carriers in the games, but once you get to about rank 5, there's usually at least one carrier, right?
yeah. But I guess my point is that, like, if you're not, if like maybe I'm not understanding what you're saying, because if you're saying like, oh, it's going to be player controlled aircraft.
I think so actually.
Yeah, if you have player like unless you're going to have massive like 64-man side games to sustain the aircraft and the ship aircraft or in the ships, then like what is the carrier actually doing? Because carriers don't have guns. I mean, basically what I'm saying is that like carrier gameplay, if you're not controlling the aircraft in some way, like World of Warships does with what is basically a real
RTS.
time strategy game. Yeah, like they don't do anything. They're basically just floating islands.
Yeah, but that's the thing though is like for to your point about the game size, I don't think you actually have to increase the number of players because in like in I think in the world that naval forces will reach, it's not going to be 64 players. It's probably going to be maybe like 15 or 20, and you're not going to have that many ships. You might have 6 or 7 ships on a team, right? And
But there's
then all players can spawn in like multiple aircraft, right? So you have a situation where if you get shot down and you were flying a plane, you can spawn another one. That's how you kind of
yeah,
get more planes into the game. But
yeah. I guess it just it raises a warning flag for me to say, hey, we're gonna have people driving carriers and their sole usefulness in this game is determined by other players choosing to fly, opposed to the
I
ships.
don't think that'll be hard because you can insert players queuing for. You basically make it an option for planes to queue in the same queue. Or, I mean, that was a lot of queue, but it's like how.
Needs more queue.
Yeah. It basically, you kind of just take people out of the people who are queuing for like realistic battle or arcade battle in normal, just air on air combat, and you just put them into the Naval Forces game. I don't think yet because their role doesn't actually change, right? Because
Yeah, their role doesn't fundamentally
yeah,
change. You're right on that.
and nothing actually changes for them because you already can bomb ships in just War Thunder in general, so that doesn't change. And you have to shoot down planes, and you have to take off carriers as well every once in a while. So none of those three things change. So I don't think that's actually going to be an issue. To your point about what carriers would do, part of what I kind of imagine, I don't think carriers will be very interesting to play, but I already kind of don't think that. I already kind of think that anyway. Part of what you have carriers do is that carriers have to coordinate with the planes that they launch. You have to tell them, like, oh, I'm here, and you have to like line up so that the planes can actually land. Like so you model like, how carriers have to like turn into the wind, if I'm not mistaken, to launch planes, right? To help planes launch and then to recover planes. And basically the carrier's job is to damage control planes, rearm planes, things like that, and also keep his ship safe from enemies. Because
Yeah.
this
Okay.
isn't going to be a situation where the map is like 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers or something like that. In theory, the map it won't be like 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers. It's not even, I don't think the maps will be that big, right? But because I think having people shooting at each other from 50 kilometers would be exceedingly boring, right? It's just, like you said, the hit ratio would be just so bad. So,
Well, that's realistic naval combat, though.
I know, but I mean, I don't think, I mean, I'm not sure what the average, I don't think you really had T-34s circling tanks and real
Yeah,
life
that's true.
engagements. They would be shooting at each other from hundreds of meters on average. I don't know. It to me, neither game really paints the picture because it's not because part of what both games are designed to do is to push players into the same area so they have to fight each other. You know, it's like you kind of make it so that people kind of congregate and then they fight each other, and that way you get lots of fast-paced action, you know, things like that. But yeah, I mean, well, I wouldn't be that surprised if carriers weren't in naval forces. I just think naval forces might be more conducive to it. And you could even take the next step and just say that the carriers have AI planes that they have to direct, you know, in some manner, you know, or whatever. And they have to kind of keep track of them and, you know, coordinate their position so they can come back and things like that. But moving away from carriers, because carriers aren't what it's going to be all about. It's going to be all about battleships and cruisers and destroyers. Submarines, no. I do not want submarines in naval forces. I think
Yeah,
they're...
for the same reason. For the same reason they're not in World of Warships,
We
because
don't need artillery. Don't need them.
well, yeah, we don't need artillery, but also the whole point, like the whole application and doctrine of how submarines work is fundamentally unfair. They're the worst kind of ambush predators, and you can't have a game where some percentage of the players are going to be like getting killed for having done nothing wrong.
Well, I mean, that happens already.
Well, I
but-
mean, for just getting like crushed by a submarine who just basically does whatever he wants with no gameplay consequence.
Well, I think part of the main reason I say that submarines shouldn't be in the game is, one, everyone would play submarines. It'd be really fucking boring. And then two, the people who aren't playing submarines are likely to play cruisers or battleships. There won't be that many destroyers. And you need destroyers to take out the, submarines.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit of a problem. It also takes what should be a surface naval game underwater, and that's where dead ships should go, not where live ships should be. So I think to start this little section off, submarines, no, they shouldn't be in the game. If
Absolutely not.
they are, that I don't think they'll be around for very long. It's a horrible idea. It really is. But to talk about battleships and cruisers, I think destroyers, I think, will actually be pretty good because they're fast and they can fire high explosive things like that. And they just basically do what they do in World of Warships, just pepper people and launch torpedoes, like whatever. Cruisers will do basically the same thing. They'll just fire lots and lots of shells. But the thing is cruisers will be much more vulnerable to battleships.
Yeah.
Because battleships won't, it won't take multiple salvos a lot of times. If they
And
score 2 or 3 good hits, the thing's toast. There are going to be massive holes in it, and cruisers don't have armor generally.
Yeah. Well, hey, just to anticipate kind of where this is going, because it's a good point. So in World of Tank, or in War Thunder, we'll stay focused on War Thunder right now. Like, every class of tank kind of has its own role. I mean, light tanks are fast, they're scouts, they're maneuverable.
I think you should say World of Tanks, because that's less so true in War Thunder.
Well, yeah, but no, even in War Thunder, like, each class or each section of tanks has things they're good at.
In theory.
Yeah, in theory, at least. Thing is that in naval combat, since you're removing a lot of the dimensions that tanks can take advantage of, like, you eventually kind of just have battleships being the only ship that's, in my mind, I can envision a game state where battleships are the only ships worth playing. They have the armor, the guns. They're not as fast, but they don't have to be, because they have a range that's roughly equal to the size of the map.
So I don't think they'll have accurate real life ranges. By the way, I think they're going to be shortened.
Yeah, but even then, like you were kind of saying, cruisers are just going to get exploded. Destroyers are just going to get exploded, unless they get.
I actually have the opposite take on this.
Okay.
And the reasoning is, it's the same reasoning that we find in War Thunder. As a whole, heavy tanks in War Thunder are second-class citizens, in my opinion. Now, the reason is that none of them have enough armor to defeat their competition. KV-1s, they angle, they have a lot of armor, but they do have vulnerable spaces on the front of their turret. and if they get flanked, they're toast. And so that's a problem. And War Thunder all comes down to your gun and your speed. So if you expand that to naval forces, right? We already discussed how a battleship's hit ratio is going to be ridiculously low, almost regardless of what you do. So you have a situation where if a battleship hits you, you're not going to have the armor to defend yourself. And that's true in World of Warships. Battleships hitting battleships, you generally do like tons of damage, or you do some damage. So you want, and think about how hard it is to hit some cruisers that are moving at full speed and turning and maneuvering, which is a real life thing that they would do. Destroyers being the same way, where it's actually really, really difficult to hit destroyers, at 10 kilometers, at least in World of Warships. So my thought is that, especially with a mechanic like plunging fire, which negates armor almost completely, I would imagine that ships that can move quickly and aren't weighed down by armor but have decent enough firepower, good enough guns, HE shells, whatever, or strong enough AP shells, are going to rule the roost. Much like how we have in current War Thunder, where a lot of the really fast, really agile tanks just dominate everybody. Hellcats, things like that.
Okay, that's a good point. Just as kind of a counter argument to that, though, you talked about reducing ranges to make for gameplay balance purposes, and basically just to give sanity, because you don't just want a game of people plugging each other over the horizon.
And also, I think the horizon would be hard to model, but yeah.
Yeah, you get the point. But the idea is that, but where I'm getting to is, if you're adjusting that, that means that the battleships are going to have the longest range, and it's going to go down from there, because at that scale, gun size is actually an indicator of range, basically.
Yeah, somewhat.
Yeah. So in that case, like, plunging fire becomes less meaningful, like less a factor the closer you are, and I can see there being a real kind of point where cruisers don't really get a lot of, like, battleships get plunging fire when they're firing at the long edge of their ranges, but a lot of fire isn't going to be pure plunging. It's going to be more like line drives, which is the only word I can think of to describe it. In that case, I hear what you're saying, that plunging fire means fast ships are going to rule the roost, because if armor doesn't matter, then you may as well be fast. Mm-hmm. But I'm not convinced that the gameplay that we're kind of envisioning is going to have a lot of plunging fire, because odds are most engagements will be at a point where trajectories, if not flat, are more like a gentle curve coming in, which granted could still mean some plunging fire, but you start talking about angles of deflection and stuff.
Well, yeah, I mean that's fair. For battleships, their plunging fire range will be farther out than cruisers and destroyers, simply because of the size of their guns.
Yeah. Okay.
However, it's less. I don't know. I'm kind of going to make a couple points just because I'm not sure which one kind of applies, because I don't fully understand what you said there, but I'll make a couple points. So plunging fire it's basically due to this, almost the caliber of your gun, just the size of your guns, right? So a cruiser's plunging fire range is going to be much closer than a battleship's, right? Well, the cruisers, if they're moving really fast, are going to be really difficult to hit. And you think about it, it almost doesn't really matter what range they're at, because the variation on the battleship's gun is going to be so great that near the edge of the battleship's ranges, they have zero chance in hitting them. If they hit it, it's because they're a god or they're really lucky. Right?
At some point, it just becomes luck.
Yeah, it's just stupendously stupid luck. Well, if you cut that in half, I don't think a battleship's accuracy actually goes up that much. I don't think it's a linear scale of accuracy to range. I think it's more of a log scale of accuracy to range, where they're really inaccurate for a long time, and then all of a sudden they get really accurate, because at that point they are firing on just a straight line drive. So I think cruisers are going to be able to find themselves in this kind of middle ground, where they're not like their max range is still an inaccurate range for a battleship, basically. And then as they move in closer, the battleships might get a little bit more accurate, and then eventually at some point you're just going to reach a point where the battleship's going to drill you every time, and you have to make yourself a small target, things like that. But the point is that cruisers' guns are generally going to be more accurate as a whole, just because.
But also significantly less damage.
Yeah, less damage, but they generally have more, or at least the same number. So, and they also fire faster. So if you think about it in terms of like steel on target, which is a stat they keep for like tanks and I think warships as well, cruisers are going to put more metal on the target than a battleship will, simply because a cruiser is going to fire them so fast, So I think when you actually look at it, if you looked at it in terms of, like I said, that statistic where it's like steel on target, cruisers are going to output more steel on target. So in theory, they should, if they're, they should basically be able to do more damage to the enemy ship. In theory, because more things are hitting, and if the deck armor is going to be thin, they will be able to penetrate deck armor basically, except for in some situations or on some ships maybe. So basically, my thought is that their cruisers are going to be able to stay out of. And now this could be completely thrown off depending on how battleships are modeled in the game. It depends how their guns operate. And cruisers for that matter. But if it works similarly to how World of Warships does, but just bigger, I guess, I see cruisers doing pretty well. And I think battleships, they'll be important, and they'll probably be useful, and they'll be able to take advantage of things, and they'll be probably pretty powerful. But I don't think they're going to be as strong. And I think people are going to quickly realize that speed is what really matters. Avoiding shots rather than taking them. Because if you take a shot, there's always that possibility of it penetrating and detonating your magazine.
Yeah, you would just to say you would think so, but I think the data points on on the tank games, the ground forces games, World of Tanks and Ground Forces, people still like to play heavy tanks.
They still like to play heavy tanks, not in War Thunder. People don't play heavy tanks really in War Thunder. World of Tanks they do. But that's because heavy tanks don't have the whole, you can completely negate my armor. They have a health pool that's bigger than everyone else's.
Okay, yeah, that actually is a good point, because I haven't played at the highest tiers, which is I assume where you're referring to.
Yeah, kind of. Well, even in the middle tiers. Basically, when heavy tanks come into the game in World of Tanks, they have more HP than other people by, a margin. Usually 1 or 2 solid hits of caliber guns. So, but in War Thunder, there's no health bar, so your heavy tanks can be one shot. So you run into this thing where you're basically just driving a bigger, slower tank that maybe has a little bit more armor, but it's not enough armor really to compete. A KV-1 can be one shot through the front, just like a T-34. So why wouldn't you play a T-34? Kind of.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay. Yeah.
So if your battleship can be one shot, just like a cruiser, and the cruiser is fast, like why wouldn't you play the cruiser? You could play the battleship and it'll be useful.
In that point though, and I think this might be a good transition point into the next topic. You're talking a lot about one-shotting battleships.
Mm-hmm.
And you're one-shotting ships in general. And I'm not super familiar with a lot of historical data around this, but I will say that like when they sank the Bismarck, which granted is kind of a bad example because Bismarck was just such a frickin' huge ship, but it took. I had it up earlier. Let me find it again. But it took a lot to sink this thing. I think ultimately it took something in the neighborhood of multiple 14-inch shell hits and 7 torpedoes. Like, so the thing is that like it's interesting to talk about the idea of getting one shot, and of course if you reference the HMS Hood,
that would be my example.
Yeah, the HMS Hood, but we could do a whole ramble on why the HMS Hood was a bad idea.
Well, it also suffered from what I'm talking about, which is plunging fire. It went through the deck armor.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but it also it basically didn't have armor. But reading here, they're looking at it. No shell penetrated the Bismarck's fully armored citadels. Like in having basically half the Royal Navy whaling on this thing.
Not half. I think it was 3 cruisers. It was 1 heavy cruiser, 2 medium or light cruisers, and then a battleship.
Yeah.
Which
No,
score,
but
which I think only scored like 1 or 2 hits, and one of them or damaged the steering or the engine power, which is why they caught up to it.
yeah. I wish
But
I'd read through this sooner because I would have remembered all this shit. But I mean, end of the day, I mean, my point is that like there for every for every story you talk, for every HMS Hood, there's a Bismarck. A
yeah,
ship
true.
that
But
yeah, and I'm just getting I'm finding it here, getting pinged it actually. The total count against the Bismarck was 1 aircraft carrier, 3 battleships, 3 cruisers, 6 destroyers.
in the
So
ultimate engagement, though, wasn't it? It was just the one battleship, which I think was it the Prince of York or something York, the
well, there was
Belfast,
the
the
King George the
Jamaica,
Fifth.
King George V. That was it. The Belfast, the Jamaica, and one other that were kind of the key players in the engagement.
Yeah, I guess and
I
yeah,
take your
we can.
point though that it is that battleships do have a lot of durability, but it's it will be a thing though. That's my key point, that being one shot will be a very real thing in naval forces. There won't be this health bar you can rely on, and you will have situations where you'll take more damage than you should, but I don't think it's going to be as often or as prevalent as people might hope. It's the same. And if you again think about how ships will be tiered, I mean, the Mouse has the most armor ever put onto a fighting vehicle, and it gets absolutely wailed on right now. Granted, it runs in the post-war competition, but it can very easily be one shot even before then. You know.
And we got I just want to kind of say that we got kind of sidetracked talking about the Bismarck, but what I was going to get to is that one shots may not be as common, and even in terms of damage modeling, unless you take a hit to a magazine that breaks the ship in half, which is what happened to the Hood basically. I mean, it's kind of like you look in War Thunder ground forces and you talk about, well, you killed, basically you killed 4 out of the 5 crew members. They can't operate the tank, kind of thing. Like that's how a lot of tanks get knocked out, is they lose, this they lose more crew than they can sustain the loss of, or you've broken so many pieces of the tank that it's no longer functional, or you've cooked an ammo rack. In ships, like, you're talking about a crew measured in thousands, or the bigger ships, and a lot of evidence says that an individual shell wasn't going to kill 1,000 people; it was going to kill 20, kind of
Yeah,
thing.
but you can also
So
consider who's being killed. Like, what if the shell hits the bridge and wipes out like the commander of the ship and like his top lieutenants or whatever,
okay, yeah,
or
so I guess,
wipes or hits goes under the water line and hits the steering and hits the propeller shafts. You know, there will be module damage, and one shot, even if it doesn't penetrate the citadel, can render a ship inoperable.
yeah, but that's the same. That's true of tanks and the
Yeah, I
but
know,
it's
but that's what I'm
but
saying.
yeah,
That's the
but I mean,
point.
but that being, I mean, that being said, but there's plenty of things in the world of tanks ground forces that would instantly destroy ship. Like if you take let's call it an 88 millimeter shell to your engine block, you can't fix that engine. That's it.
Yeah,
But
you'd probably
in
get
War
set on
Thunder,
fire.
yeah, I mean, you probably get set on fire. But let's say you don't get set on fire, you put the fire out. You just took an 88 millimeter shell to your engine block. That engine is no longer an engine. It's a block of steel and twisted shrapnel, probably. So but in War Thunder, you're able to repair that damage, and presumably that's because it'd be boring
In
otherwise.
theory, you could, and yeah, it would be horrible for gameplay if you take one hit. If you like throw a track
Yeah,
and you
and then
can't
it
move the
takes an
rest of the
hour
game.
I mean, it takes a lot of time to fix a thrown track.
Yeah, but and in War Thunder, they've modeled it in such a way where, based on the ranges in the game, it's significant amount of time to maintain some type of gameplay. Yeah, but I don't buy that these ships are going to be, you know, juggernauts. They certainly won't be, you know.
Yeah, well, there's
And
also
and
not a
I
lot of
think,
good data about that.
yeah, and also I kind of think I'm kind of the opinion that a lot of times when a ship survives a lot of hits, I think it has less to do with the ship and more to do that with luck, right? Because like not getting the Citadel realistically isn't that big of a target when you think about it in the grand scheme of things at long range,
Yeah.
and it does have a lot of armor on it. But if you're shooting at it from like 30 kilometers away, it's it's entirely possible every shell will miss it, right? So I don't know. I don't buy. I think that when ships take inordinate amounts of punishment, I think it's more so to do with luck than the ship's design. Now,
Yeah.
ships can be designed with all the armor in the world and have the armor to withstand this, but those can be one-shotted just like the rest of them. It's still a possibility, and it will
Hey,
always be a possibility.
yeah, just as a side note, kind of rewinding, I'm just reading more about the sinking of the Bismarck. So they estimate at around 902, a 16-inch shell from the Rodney, which I guess is another one of the ships in the area, hit the Bismarck's forward superstructure, they believe, killing the entire bridge staff.
See,
So
that's a
it
pretty
was,
critical problem.
yeah, but the ship continued to fight until 931, when finally all of its main battery turrets were put out. I mean, and they were talking about there are, like, basically what I'm saying is that there are officers stationed throughout the ship. So even if you do lose the bridge, like, the ship keeps fighting because the ship is so much bigger than just the bridge.
Yeah, but now the ship is not going to do anything. It's not going anywhere. It's not going to change course, really, because there's no one to give those orders. The ship is going to continue doing a very linear thing. And
I've
it's,
got to believe that it's more
well,
nuanced than that.
if you lose the bridge, you lose the steering, where the steering is given, right?
Yeah,
That's where they
but
determine how to steer the
presumably
ship.
there's a chain of command where somebody eventually makes this decision, even if it's the engine room. Like, maybe, eventually it defaults back to the guys who have the engines to say, "Hey, start driving."
Yeah,
But
I don't know if they
that's
would.
beside the point.
Yeah, but I get your point, but also I don't buy the fact that these ships are going to be anywhere near as juggernauty as people would like to think.
Yeah.
I think
Okay.
I think getting one shot is going to be something we're going to have to learn to deal with like we do in tanks.
Yeah.
Right? Like a mouse getting one shot frontally sucks, but it can happen. That's the thing. And the mouse isn't a great example because it runs into post-war ammunition and they kind of just wreck it.
Yeah.
But when it was first introduced, it didn't really. And it still could be one shot frontally. So, yeah. I guess to wrap up that, I think that's going to be something we're going to have to get used to. Is the idea of being exploded. So, and if carriers are in the game, it'll be true for carriers. What if a carrier plane dropped bomb, armor piercing bomb penetrates the boiler room or whatever?
Yeah. Or penetrates the flight deck and blows a huge hunk out of the flight deck. Like, it takes hours, days even to repair that kind of damage.
Well, and it could spark a fire. HE shells hitting the superstructure could spark fires or cause fires, which could cause a serious problem for a ship.
Yeah.
And
Needless to say.
that would be a problem. That would definitely be a problem. So, anyway. So have we run this ramble to its course?
I think we have. I mean, there's just not enough good data, and I guess this is kind of my
It's worth
conclusion. But
there's not even really going to be a conclusion because there's no, like you said, there is no data. This is all pure speculation.
yeah, but I mean, I think there are definitely some question marks in this game system, like what they're going to be in terms of, are carriers going to be included? What does that gameplay look like? How are they going to balance realism of naval warfare in this era? And as a side note, when are they going to draw the line? Are they going to do kind of like what World of Warships does, picking up basically, from kind of the end of the Dreadnought era into the end of World War II? Or are they going to be a little bit? Or are they going to go up to, like, say, the Korean War, which I think is kind of what they've done?
Well, I don't think they'll go past the end of World War II because no new battleships were actually built after World War II, if I'm not mistaken. The Montana was the last designed, the Montana class was the last designed American battleships, and they were never built because the war ended. The Iowa class is actually the last battleships that America built, and we were using them until I think the Missouri, I think, was still in use in the 90s for Gulf,
There's,
for
yeah, well, there's
the
probably
Gulf War.
Several of the Iowa classes are still around.
No, I think
as,
they're
like,
all. I think they've all
have
been.
they all been officially decommissioned or
I
just
think they've been
mothballed?
at least mothballed, and I think they have. I don't know if they've been decommissioned or not, but we don't use them anymore, which is the point. Because you think about it, they're useless, right? They really kind of are. Everything you can do with a battleship, you can do with a carrier-borne plane. You know, and
Or
it's way more
with a
precise
cruiser for the
too.
most part.
It's way more
Yeah,
precise. No,
yeah. The
cruiser doesn't even
advent,
have to go in range; just launch its Tomahawk missiles.
yeah, exactly. The cruise missiles made battleships redundant because there are better
Oh,
ways to force project than
you know what
large
they did with
caliber
the
shells.
Iowa classes? A lot of them, I
What?
think, are museum ships now,
Well, they are
or
cool
the
ships.
few. Like I think Missouri is definitely, I think, a museum ship. I mean, it's the most important one of the bunch, probably. But I think
Yeah.
Iowa, the the lead ship in the class, I think it's also museumed. I don't know though. I'd have to look that up. But anyway, it's on the West Coast somewhere. I think it's in California, the Mizzou. But anyway, that'll be it for this ramble, I think. So thank you all for watching. I've been Corny Swiss,
I'm Corny Phil.
and I hope you enjoyed all this little speculation. Feel free to discuss it in the comment section. And yeah, thanks for watching. See you next time.
Yeah. Bye.